I used to dream of escape, just like everyone else. I'd spend hours tracing the frayed edges of the Appalachian map plastered to my bedroom wall, imagining a life where the horizon didn't just end, where the mountains weren't a wall, but a starting line. We call it Hollow Creek, a neat, unassuming name for a place built on silence, decay, and 5 rules designed to keep the population from hitting 0. It's an old coal town, tucked away in the deepest folds of the West Virginia wilderness. We don't have much here, just a few thousand souls, a failing logging mill, and a constant swirling mist that the sun only visits in the briefest, most pathetic shifts. Our town council actually prints the rules on a pamphlet, folded and stapled like they're offering directions to the nearest scenic overlook, rather than instructions on how not to get hollowed out. I've seen them all. The glassy-eyed new arrivals, usually fleeing the city for cheap real estate, who smile politely when I hand them the pamphlet and laugh as soon as my back is turned. I'm the town postmaster, see, Elias Thorne. It sounds important, but it mostly means I'm the first to know when a package is late or who is secretly subscribed to those fancy magazines they think nobody notices. Being the gatekeeper of the physical world also means I'm the designated welcome wagon. I greet the newcomers at the pit stop gas station, our only gas station, where the pumps have dials from 1985 and the smell of stale coffee is structural. The new couple stuck out before they even got out of their car. It was a brand new black SUV, spotless and aggressive, with out-of-state plates. Austin, Texas. That's a lot of flat road between them and Hollow Creek. They were clean-cut and bright, like a couple in a real estate advertisement, laughing and looking around at our rusting infrastructure as if it were charming folk art. I was standing near the door of the pit stop, holding a sack of mail that felt mostly like bills and flyers for a 50. "Morning," I said, offering a practiced weak smile. "I assume you're the new owners of the old Miller place?" "Yes," Chloe beamed, putting her useless phone away. "Chloe and Mark, we're so excited. We're going to do a podcast about the flip, urban pioneers in Appalachia. It's going to be huge." Urban pioneers, podcast. I felt a familiar, tired ache settle behind my eyes. This was the 5th time I'd heard that exact elevator pitch from newcomers. None of them had made it past the first winter. "Right," I said. "Well, welcome to Hollow Creek. I'm Elias Thorne, the postmaster. You'll be getting your mailbacks at the station, but in the meantime," I held out the stapled pamphlet, "our town council has some local guidelines for living here." Chloe took it, her smile slightly forced now as she scanned the stapled paper. "Guidelines? Like garbage day and noise ordinances?" She read the first line. "Hollow Creek rules for resident safety." Her eyebrow shot up. "This looks intense." Mark leaned in, smirking. "Never whistle after dark? Seriously? What is this, 1850? I didn't answer. You can't just explain rule number 1. You can't just explain what happens if you invite their attention. The sound they make. The sound that answers. The echo. "Guidelines are rules in this case," I said, my voice slipping back to its flat monotone. "Most of us find we'll give it a thorough read while we're enjoying our intense tranquility." They were too far gone to save with a stapled pamphlet. I knew that, but I'm still compelled to try. Rule number 4 is the covered bridge just before you get to the Miller place. Do not cross it after 8 p.m., not even by car. Lock the gates. Chloe looked back, her eyes wide with a confusion that wasn't dismissive anymore, but a genuine slight fear. "The bridge? Why? Is it structurally unsound?" "Not in the way you mean," I said. "Just lock the gates." I didn't wait for them to finish. I turned and walked into the pit stop. The old screen door slammed shut behind me, a familiar, final sound that siempre reminds me of the town's borders slamming shut for the day. My own night ritual begins at 7:30 p.m. I go home to my small, fortified cabin at the edge of town, right where the trees start to crowd the single-lane road. I check my jars. Jars of iron filings, sealed tight and placed by every door and window. It's a trick I learned from my grandfather, the last truly old-school resident who seemed to understand the mechanics of what lived in the mist. "It deters them," he'd say, tapping a jar with a gnarled, scar-covered finger, like a bad smell or static on the radio. "They hate things that hold a shape, things that are solid." I never saw him whistle after dark. Not once. I checked the jars tonight. Perfect. Full and sealed. I locked the deadbolt on the front door, the extra chain lock, and slide the heavy iron bar across the doorframe. Then I pulled the heavy blackout curtains tight. The cabin becomes a tomb, and I feel safe. The town goes absolutely silent at 8 p.m. It's a physical presence, a weight that presses against the cabin walls. We all do it. The lights go off, the noise stops. We hide. We disappear. It's the only way to be. But tonight, the silence wasn't perfect. It was frayed at the edges. I was sitting in my worn armchair, reading by the dim amber light of a single battery-powered lantern, when I heard it. A faint sound. A distant, sharp, cheerful whistle. It didn't match the rhythm of the wind. It was intelligent. It was human. And it was coming from the direction of the old covered bridge, just as the digital clock on my wall clicked to 8:01 p.m. A chill, cold and immediate, spread from my spine. They were breaking rule number 1. They were breaking rule number 4. They weren't just tempting fate, they were screaming at it to do its worst. And then I heard the sound that usually only appears in my nightmares. The answer, the echo. A moment of silence, followed by the exact same whistle, perfect and sharp, answering back from inside the covered bridge. Only this time, it was distorted, overlaid with a strange, hollow buzzing, as if the sound itself had been dragged through a static-filled tunnel. A new noise joined the symphony. The roar of a brand-new SUV, its headlights cutting through the oppressive fog. Mark and Chloe were driving across the bridge 1 minute past the deadline. I didn't move. There was nothing I could do. The rules aren't just suggestions, Chloe and Mark. They are the physical boundaries of our world. And you just stepped right off the cliff. I put my lantern down and walked to the single window in my cabin that I have never covered with blackout curtains. It's high up and narrow, a single slit of glass that looks towards the Miller property. I have binoculars hidden in a hollow Bible near the frame. I retrieved them now. My grandfather's trick. You gotta know where they are, boy. You gotta see the shape they make. The mist was so thick it was like looking through a bowl of gray milk. But the black SUV had powerful LED headlights that carved twin tunnels through the fog. I could see the car idling just inside the ornate iron gates of the Miller property. They had ignored rule number 5, too. Never look directly at a deer with too many eyes. Through the binoculars, I saw them, not the deer, just the headlights. But then, standing at the very edge of the mist-choked tree line, right next to where the SUV was parked, I saw him, the buck. We call him Buck, but he's not a deer, not truly. He's massive, ancient, with antlers that look less like bone and more like the jagged, petrified roots of a corrupted tree. He stands perfectly still, always, watching. His eyes, and there were many, an unnerving cluster of them blinking and reflecting the LED headlights within the deep, creeping shadows, revealed his nature. He doesn't move. He just invites. He wasn't inviting Mark and Chloe. They were just the latest to accept. He was looking directly towards me, direct contact, a connection made across the silence. He knew I was watching. He knew what I was thinking. And then the sound again, from the fog right outside my own cabin window, my mother's voice. My mother, who has been in the ground for 10 years. "Elias, son, could you come out and help me with the groceries? I think I overdid it today." I didn't breathe. My hand clenched around the iron filing jar near the door, white-knuckled and trembling. It wasn't her. It was an invitation. It was the echo. The invitation from Buck passed through my mother's warped memory. I grabbed the iron jar and held it tight to my chest, squeezing my eyes shut. I started praying, whispers of my grandfather's old, forgotten verses. The voice outside continued, getting louder, more insistent, overlaid with that horrifying, buzzing static. "Elias, don't be rude. Your father is waiting. Just open the door." I have to survive tonight, and I can't help you, Chloe and Mark, because the grace period is over. The welcoming is finished. The collection has begun. I have to grab my iron jar and pray that Hollow Creek doesn't get another permanent resident. The voice outside my window didn't stop until the digital clock on my microwave flashed 5:43 a.m. For 7 hours and 42 minutes, I sat immobilized in my grandfather's worn armchair, the jar of iron filings clutched to my chest so tightly my fingers had gone completely numb. The entity on the other side of the glass had cycled through a horrifying repertoire of manipulation. First, it was the sweet, concerned tone of my late mother, begging me to let her out of the cold. When I didn't move, the voice shifted, dropping an octave, taking on a wet, congested quality, like lungs filling with river mud. It became my father, demanding I open the door, then my third-grade teacher, then old Mrs. Gable, who died of a stroke 3 years ago. By 3 a.m., it had stopped using voices I recognized and started using sounds. The frantic, wet tearing of meat, the high-pitched, metallic shriek of straining steel, the sound of a human spine snapping under immense pressure. It was trying to find the frequency of my breaking point, the exact acoustic trigger that would make me abandon reason and throw the deadbolts out of sheer panicked desperation. But I am Elias Thorne, and I was raised in Hollow Creek. My breaking point was calloused over decades ago. When the first anemic rays of dawn finally managed to penetrate the thick canopy of the Appalachian pines, the noises simply ceased. There was no retreating footstep, no rustle of underbrush. Just an abrupt, deafening vacuum of sound, signaling that the night shift was over. I waited until 6:30 a.m. before I moved. My joints popped in protest as I stood, my legs trembling from adrenaline exhaustion. I carefully set the iron jar back on its designated shelf above the doorframe. I slid the heavy iron bar free, unhooked the chain, and turned the deadbolt. The morning air hit me like a damp, freezing towel. The mist was still heavy, a suffocating gray blanket that smelled of wet decay and ozone. I stepped onto my small porch and looked down at the wooden planks beneath the window. There were footprints. They weren't human. They weren't animal either. They were long, shallow depressions in the dew-soaked wood, leaving behind a residue that looked like black, iridescent oil. Whatever had stood there mimicking my mother hadn't been wearing shoes, and it certainly hadn't had toes. I fetched a bucket of bleach and a heavy wire brush from the shed and spent 20 minutes scrubbing the wood until the black residue was gone, though the stain it left behind in the grain would be there forever. You can't leave their marks around. It acts like a beacon for the next night. I drove my battered postal jeep down into the valley toward the pit stop. The town of Hollow Creek was beginning its slow, hesitant waking process. A few porch lights flickered off. The smokestack at the mill let out a pathetic puff of gray exhaust. Nobody was out walking. We don't do morning jogs here. The bell above the gas station door jingled, a sharp, cheerful sound that always felt deeply out of place. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of burnt percolator coffee and cheap chewing tobacco. Sheriff Hutch Hutchinson was already there, leaning his massive frame against the counter, a styrofoam cup dwarfed by his meaty hand. Hutch is a man carved from the same hard, unforgiving bedrock as the mountains around us. He's been sheriff for 20 years, mostly because his job description consists entirely of filling out paperwork for accidental hiking deaths and making sure nobody does anything stupid enough to endanger the rest of the town. He didn't look at me as I walked in. He just took a slow sip of his coffee. "Morning, Elias," Hutch rumbled. His voice sounded like gravel in a cement mixer. "Hutch," I replied, moving behind the counter to grab the canvas sack of incoming mail the regional truck had dropped off before dawn. "Quiet night?" Hutch finally turned his head. His eyes were deeply bloodshot, ringed with heavy dark bags. He looked older than his 50-odd years. "You know damn well it wasn't a quiet night, Elias. I heard it." I stopped sorting the letters. "The whistle?" Loud and clear. Came right down the valley off the ridge. Hutch set his cup down, the plastic compressing under his grip. Heard the echo, too. Then the engine of that shiny new rig the out-of-towners brought in. They crossed the covered bridge at 8:03. "I told them," I said, my voice defensive, though I knew Hutch wasn't blaming me. "I handed them the pamphlet. I told them to lock the gates and stay off the bridge." "I know you did, son," Hutch sighed, rubbing his bristly jaw. "You always do. But city folks, they got this armor of arrogance. They think the world owes them an explanation for everything. They think if they can't Google a monster, it don't exist." "So what do we do?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Rule number 2, do not leave your home for a cry of help. The town mourns in the morning. "We don't do a damn thing," Hutch said, confirming the grim reality of our existence. "We wait for the dust to settle. We see if they show up in town today. If they don't, well, I'll take a drive up to the Miller place tomorrow and see what needs cleaning up." I nodded, returning to my sorting. That was the Hollow Creek way. We survived by minding our own business and keeping our heads down. But as I pulled a thick, padded envelope from the bottom of the sack, my stomach twisted. The label was bright, cheerful, and addressed to Chloe Masters and Mark Davis, 144 Miller Ridge Road. The return address was an electronics store in New York. Podcast equipment, no doubt. High-end microphones to capture the unmatched tranquility of our living nightmare. "I have a package for them," I said quietly. Hutch eyed the envelope. "You don't have to take it up there, Elias. Mark it undeliverable. Return to sender. If they're gone, they ain't gonna need a new microphone." "And if they aren't gone?" I asked. "If they survive the night?" "The Postal Service has its own rules, Hutch. I have to attempt delivery." It was a flimsy excuse. The truth was, a morbid, creeping curiosity had taken root in my chest. I had seen the buck standing at the edge of the tree line. I had heard the echo. Nobody survived that combination. Nobody. If Mark and Chloe were still breathing, I needed to see it with my own eyes. I needed to know what the rules looked like when they were broken and the debt hadn't been collected in blood. Hutch stared at me for a long, heavy moment. He saw right through my Postal Service excuse, but he didn't call me on it. "You go in broad daylight," he commanded. "You don't cross that threshold. You drop the box on the porch, you knock, and you get your ass back in that Jeep. If you see anything that don't sit right in your gut, you leave them to it." "Understood," I said. By 10 a.m., the fog had thinned enough to see a quarter-mile down the road, though the sky remained a bruised, sullen gray. I drove the Jeep of the winding, pothole-riddled asphalt of Miller Ridge Road. The trees pressed in close here, ancient oaks and pines that seemed to lean toward the road, their branches interlacing overhead to form a claustrophobic tunnel. I reached the covered bridge. Even in the daylight, it was an imposing structure. The wood was black with age and rot, sagging ominously in the middle. The warning signs posted on either end, "Danger, structural damage, proceed with caution," were just the town council's legally acceptable way of keeping tourists away. As my Jeep rumbled over the wooden planks, I rolled my window up tight. I couldn't help but look at the interior walls of the bridge. They were covered in deep, gouged scratches, like a massive bear had spent decades sharpening its claws against the timber. I held my breath until I was out the other side. The Miller place sat atop a small rise, surrounded by overgrown, untamed wilderness. It was a sprawling 3-story Victorian monstrosity that had been vacant for 15 years before Mark and Chloe bought it sight unseen. The paint was peeling in long gray strips like dead skin, and the wraparound porch sagged dangerously. Their black SUV was parked in the driveway. I pulled up behind it and killed the engine. The silence rushed in, broken only by the ticking of my Jeep's cooling engine block. I grabbed the padded envelope and stepped out. That's when I noticed the SUV. The driver's side door was caved in, a massive, jagged dent that looked like a bowling ball had been swung into it with the force of a wrecking ball. But that wasn't the worst part. Smeared across the dent and trailing down the side of the pristine black paint was a thick, viscous gray substance. It looked like sap, but it smelled like old copper and rotting meat. My heart hammered against my ribs. I thought about Hutch's advice: drop the box and leave, but my feet carried me toward the porch. The wooden stairs groaned in agony under my weight. I placed the package on the welcome mat, a ridiculous little thing that said, "Home is where the Wi-Fi connects," and raised my fist to knock on the heavy oak door. Before my knuckles could strike the wood, the door swung open. Mark stood in the doorway. He was wearing the same expensive flannel shirt he'd had on yesterday, but it was heavily wrinkled now. "Elias!" Mark shouted. His voice was incredibly loud, booming out onto the quiet porch. He smiled, a wide, enthusiastic grin that showed too many teeth. "The postman rings twice, right? Man, you guys have great service out here." I stared at him. Something was fundamentally wrong. It wasn't just the manic energy or the fact that his pupils were dilated so wide his eyes looked almost entirely black. It was his posture. He stood perfectly rigid, his arms hanging limp at his sides, his neck craned forward at an unnatural angle. I have a package," I stammered, pointing down at the mat. "Fantastic! The new mics. We need 'em," Mark said. He didn't look down at the package. He just kept staring directly into my eyes, that terrifying, stretched smile plastered across his face. "Rough night?" I asked, my eyes darting toward the driveway. "Your car looks like it took a hit." Mark let out a booming laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, that?" "Yeah, ran into some local wildlife. A deer. Massive thing. It was wild, Elias. Truly wild." "A deer," I repeated, my blood running cold. Rule number 5. "Yeah, but we're fine. Never better, actually," Mark said. He leaned in closer, and I caught a whiff of his breath. It smelled like the gray sap on the side of his car, old copper and rot. "We had the most incredible night, Elias. The tranquility up here, it's completely mind-blowing." Behind him, in the dim, unlit hallway of the house, a figure moved. It was Chloe. She was facing the wall, her forehead pressed against the faded floral wallpaper. She was gently, rhythmically tapping her head against the plaster. Thud, thud, thud. "Is your wife okay?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. My hand instinctively reached for the pocket where I kept my grandfather's pocket knife, a pathetic comfort against what I was looking at. Mark didn't turn to look at her. His smile just widened, the skin around his mouth pulling tight enough to tear. "Chloe? Oh, she's amazing. She's just taking it all in," Mark said. His voice dropped an octave, losing its cheerful edge, adopting that wet, congested quality I had heard outside my window at 3 a.m. "We both are. We're letting the outside in, Elias. You should really try it sometime. It's so much better than hiding behind iron." He knew about the jars. I didn't say another word. I turned on my heel, bolted down the porch stairs, and threw myself into my Jeep. I threw it into reverse, the tires spinning on the gravel, and slammed it into drive, tearing down the mountain road toward the bridge. I looked in the rearview mirror just before the trees swallowed the house. Mark was standing on the edge of the porch, perfectly still, watching me go. And next to him, standing on its hind legs, was the massive, many-eyed silhouette of the buck, its petrified antlers scraping against the porch roof. Mark hadn't survived the night. The town of Hollow Creek hadn't gained 2 new residents. We had just gained 2 new hollow things, and they knew exactly where I lived. I don't remember the drive down Miller Ridge. My mind simply refused to record the sheer white-knuckled panic of my descent. I only came back to myself when my Jeep slammed over the uneven railroad tracks at the edge of town, the suspension screaming in protest as the tires bit into the main street asphalt. I laid on the horn, a long, blaring bleat that shattered the morning quiet, pulling the Jeep in at a sharp diagonal across the 2 parking spaces in front of the sheriff's station. I left the keys in the ignition and the door hanging open. I took the 3 concrete steps to the station in a single bound and threw my shoulder against the heavy glass door. Hutch was at his desk, methodically cleaning the cylinder of his heavy .357 Magnum. He didn't jump when I crashed into the room, but his eyes snapped up, instantly reading the sheer terror radiating off me. He set the gun down, the metal clacking loudly against the scarred wooden desk. "They're gone, Hutch," I gasped, my hands braced on my knees as I fought to pull air into my burning lungs. "They're completely gone, hollowed out." Hutch didn't ask for clarification. He stood up, his massive frame blocking the harsh fluorescent light above his desk. "You looked them in the eye, Elias. Tell me exactly what you saw." I swallowed the metallic taste of adrenaline in my mouth. Mark opened the door. He was smiling. Hutch, it wasn't a real smile. It was like someone had taken fish hooks to the corners of his mouth and pulled. His eyes were completely black, pupils blown wide open. He smelled like that gray sap, the rot and copper. And Chloe, I shuddered, the image of her facing the floral wallpaper burning itself into my retinas. Chloe was in the hallway, just rhythmically banging her forehead against the wall. Thud, thud, thud. She didn't even turn around. Hutch's jaw tightened. "Did they try to grab you? Did they step off the porch?" "No," I said, leaning against a file cabinet for support. But Mark spoke to me. He talked about the tranquility of the woods. He said they were letting the outside in. And Hutch, he knew about my grandfather's jars. He looked right at me and told me it was better than hiding behind iron. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the small office. The ticking of the cheap wall clock sounded like a judge's gavel. "If they know about the iron," Hutch said slowly, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper, "then the rules of engagement are changing. The buck isn't just taking them anymore. He's reading them. He's wearing them like suits, and he's reading their minds to learn about us." They were standing right next to the buck, I added, the memory making my stomach heave. It was right beside the porch. In the daylight, Hutch. The mist wasn't even that thick. It just stood there, letting me see it. Hutch cursed, a venomous, sharp word that felt entirely appropriate. He grabbed his gun, snapping the cylinder shut with a flick of his wrist, and dropped it into his holster. He grabbed a heavy ring of keys and a battered walkie-talkie. "Protocol hasn't been invoked since '98, Hutch muttered, more to himself than to me. "But we don't have a choice. We have a breach." "What do we do?" "We lock down the public spaces. We enact rule number 3 town-wide," Hutch said, moving toward the door. "If they come into town, nobody makes eye contact. Nobody acknowledges them. We treat them like ghosts until the sun goes down, and then we pray they wander back into the woods." "And if they don't?" I asked. Hutch stopped with his hand on the door handle. "Then I have to put them down. And you know as well as I do, Elias, bullets don't do much more than annoy the things wearing their skin. Come on, we need to get to the Rusty Spoon. Half the town is in there eating breakfast, completely blind to what's coming down the mountain." The Rusty Spoon Diner was the pulsing heart of Hollow Creek. It was a chrome and vinyl relic from the 1970s that smelled eternally of bacon grease, bleach, and burnt hash browns. Martha, a woman with a towering beehive of gray hair and a permanently sour expression, ran the place with an iron fist. When Hutch and I walked in, the diner was at a low hum. Mayor Higgins was in his usual booth, nursing a black coffee. A few loggers from the mill sat at the counter, their heavy boots caked in mud. Normalcy. A fragile, paper-thin illusion of normalcy. Hutch didn't shout. He didn't cause a panic. He just walked behind the counter, leaned close to Martha, and murmured something in her ear. Martha's face drained of color. She wiped her hands on her apron, her eyes darting toward the front windows. She gave Hutch a stiff nod, then picked up a heavy cast-iron frying pan from the stove and placed it quietly on the shelf beneath the register. Hutch motioned for me to sit at the counter. I slid onto a red vinyl stool, my back rigid. The sheriff moved through the diner, leaning down to whisper to the mayor, then to the loggers. The effect was immediate and chilling. The low hum of conversation evaporated. Silverware clinked against porcelain with nervous, jerky movements. The air grew thick, static-charged with the collective terror of a town that knows the monster has breached the gates. We waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. I watched the clock above the kitchen doors tick away the morning. Maybe they would stay on the ridge. Maybe they were just content to possess the house. Then, the little bell above the diner door jingled, a sharp, cheerful sound. The temperature in the diner seemed to plummet 10 degrees. Nobody turned their heads. Nobody gasped. According to rule number 3, if you see someone who looks like a neighbor but casts no shadow, do not acknowledge them. Look away. We were all suddenly deeply engrossed in our pancakes and coffee mugs. From the corner of my eye, I saw them enter, Mark and Chloe. They moved with a terrifying synchronization. Their footsteps fell on the linoleum floor at the exact same millisecond. Step, step, step. It was a grotesque marching band of 2. Chloe was wearing a pristine white sundress that she definitely hadn't been wearing an hour ago, but the hem was stained with thick, dark mud and streaks of that glistening gray sap. Mark was still in his flannel, but it was buttoned up entirely wrong, the collar skewed high on his neck. They didn't just walk, they glided, their torsos remaining perfectly still while their legs propelled them forward. "Don't look at them," I chanted in my head, staring intently at the swirl of cream in my coffee mug. "Don't look. Don't speak." They bypassed the empty booths. They bypassed the mayor. They walked straight toward the counter. They took the 2 empty stools directly to my left. The smell hit me first. The stench of an open grave, masked poorly by an overpowering wave of expensive floral perfume. It made my eyes water. "Good morning, Hollow Creek," Mark's voice boomed. It was too loud for the small diner, practically echoing off the chrome fixtures. Silence. No one answered. The loggers down the counter were statues. Martha was frozen by the grill, her back turned to us. "We are just starving after our first night in the country," Mark continued, his voice vibrating with that awful manic energy. "The air up here really gives you an appetite." "Doesn't it, Chloe?" Chloe didn't answer right away. When she did, the sound made my blood turn to ice water. It wasn't a human voice. It sounded like multiple voices layered over one another, played back through a cheap, blown-out speaker. "A ravenous appetite," Chloe's synthesized voice buzzed. "We want meat, raw and bloody." Martha's shoulders stiffened, but she didn't turn around. She kept her eyes locked on the greasy grill. Mark leaned forward, resting his elbows on the laminate counter. His arm brushed against mine. The contact sent a shockwave of revulsion through my system. His skin was freezing cold, hard and unyielding as marble. "You're the postman," Mark whispered. His voice had dropped the cheerful facade. It was right in my ear now, intimate and horrifying. "Elias, the one with the jars." I gripped my coffee mug so hard I thought the ceramic would shatter in my hand. I stared at the dark liquid, refusing to turn my head. Rule number 3, ignore them. They are not here. "It's rude to ignore your new neighbors, Elias," Mark chided, a wet clicking sound punctuating his words. "We just wanted to thank you for the pamphlet. It was so informative. But your rules are flawed. You think keeping the doors locked keeps us out, but we don't need doors, Elias. We just need an invitation. And Chloe and I, we invited the whole forest inside." I could see his reflection in the chrome napkin dispenser. His face was inches from mine. His jaw was unhinged, hanging impossibly low, revealing a dark, endless cavern behind teeth that had filed themselves into jagged, needle-like points. "Look at me, Elias," the thing-wearing Mark demanded, the voice taking on the timbre of my dead father again. "Look at me, son." My resolve fractured. A single treacherous tear slipped down my cheek. The psychological pressure was crushing my chest. I could feel the darkness radiating off them, a gravitational pull of pure malice trying to drag me into their hollowed-out existence. Suddenly, a heavy hand slammed down on the counter between Mark and me. "We don't serve your kind here," Hutch growled. The sheriff was standing right behind us. He had broken rule number 3. He had acknowledged them. The diner collectively held its breath. Mark turned his head slowly to look at Hutch. The sickening crack of his neck vertebrae echoed in the quiet room. The impossible smile stretched even wider. "Sheriff Hutchinson," Mark said, his voice returning to the booming, artificial cheer. "So glad you could join us. We were just telling Elias about our renovations. We're doing a total gut job on the Miller place, ripping out the old insulation, exposing the bones." "You need to leave," Hutch said, his hand resting casually on the butt of his .357. His voice was steady, but I could see the subtle tremor in his fingers. "Right now. Walk out the door, get in your car, and go back up the ridge. You are not welcome in this town." Chloe turned around on her stool. Her eyes were milky white, the irises completely gone. She looked at Hutch and tilted her head at a 90-degree angle, a motion no human spine could support. "The town is already ours, Sheriff," Chloe buzzed, a dozen dead voices chorusing through her lips. "We are the welcome wagon now. We are the new rules." Mark stood up. He didn't push off the stool. He simply rose vertically, defying gravity. He towered over Hutch, though the sheriff was 6'4". Mark reached out and tapped the silver star pinned to Hutch's chest with one long, perfectly manicured finger. The metal of the badge immediately began to tarnish, turning black and brittle where he touched it. "We'll see you tonight, Elias," Mark whispered, his gaze sliding past Hutch to lock onto me in the chrome reflection. "Make sure you fill your little jars. It makes the game so much more fun when you think you have a chance." Without another word, Mark and Chloe turned and glided toward the door. The synchronized step, step, step resumed. They walked out into the gray, overcast morning, the little bell jingling merrily behind them. No one spoke for a full 5 minutes after the door swung shut. The stench of rot lingered in the air, a physical weight in the diner. Martha finally turned around from the grill. Her face was ashen, her hands shaking violently. She looked at the counter where Mark had rested his arms. The laminate surface was warped and bubbling, as if someone had held a blowtorch to the plastic. Hutch let out a long, ragged exhale. He looked out at his tarnished badge, then met my eyes. The grim resolve in his face had been replaced by something much worse. Defeat. "They are just hunting anymore," Hutch said quietly, his voice hollow. "They're moving in. They're going to systematically dismantle this town from the inside out." I looked out the diner window, watching the mist roll down from the Appalachian peaks, thicker and darker than it had been an hour ago. The sun was barely visible, a pale, sickly disk behind the clouds. "What do we do tonight, Hutch?" I asked, the terror settling deep into my bones, becoming a permanent part of my anatomy. Hutch unbuttoned his shirt pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. We break rule number 2. We don't hide in our separate houses tonight. If they want a war, we give them one. Tonight, Elias, you don't go back to the cabin. We're making a stand at the station. The rules of Hollow Creek had kept us alive for generations. But as the clock above the kitchen ticked relentlessly toward evening, I realized the terrifying truth. The rules were dead. And soon, if we didn't figure out how to fight the things wearing Mark and Chloe's skin, we would be too. The afternoon felt less like the passage of time and more like a slow, suffocating burial. In Hollow Creek, we usually spent our daylight hours pretending the night didn't exist. We worked the mill, we sorted the mail, we drank Martha's bitter coffee, and we never, ever talked about the shadows that stretched just a little too far from the tree line. But that afternoon, the illusion was shattered irreparably. The town was a kicked anthill, buzzing with a suppressed, frantic panic. Word of what happened at the Rusty Spoon had spread with the speed of a wildfire in a drought. People were boarding up their windows before 3 p.m. You could hear the staccato rhythm of hammers driving nails into heavy plywood echoing down Main Street, a desperate, pathetic drumbeat against an enemy that didn't care about wood or glass. Hutch and I didn't board up windows. We went to work turning the Hollow Creek Sheriff's Station into a fortress. Station 59 was a squat, brutalist block of poured concrete erected in the late 1970s, back when the coal money was still flowing and the town council wanted to project an image of immovable authority. It had narrow, slit-like windows laced with chicken wire, a heavy reinforced steel front door, and 3 holding cells in the back that smelled permanently of bleach and stale urine. It was ugly, cold, and entirely uninviting. It was perfect. "Get the heavy jars from my truck, Elias," Hutch ordered, his voice tight. He was hauling a crate of 12-gauge shotgun shells onto his desk. "And tell Martha to hurry up with the salt." "Salt?" I asked, pausing at the door. "My grandfather always said salt was for ghost stories. Iron is what grounds them." Hutch slammed a box of shells down. "Your grandfather never saw them walk into a diner at 10 in the morning and order human meat, Elias. The old rules are dead. We're throwing everything at the wall tonight. Iron, salt, holy water, whatever the hell we can find. If Martha thinks her grandmother's rock salt recipe keeps the devil out, we're using it." Martha arrived 10 minutes later, lugging 2 massive 50-pound industrial sacks of coarse rock salt used for melting ice on the mountain roads. Mayor Higgins was supposed to come with her, but he'd called Hutch in a blind panic an hour earlier, locking himself inside his reinforced basement on the other side of town. I silently prayed for the mayor, but I knew in my gut that a basement door wasn't going to stop the things wearing Mark and Chloe. The 3 of us worked in grim silence. I poured thick, unbroken lines of iron filings across every threshold, the front door, the back emergency exit, the frames of the slit windows. Martha followed behind me, dumping heavy mounds of rock salt over the iron, creating a dual-layered barrier of Appalachian folklore and desperate hope. Hutch was busy loading weapons. He handed me a short-barreled pump-action shotgun. "I don't know how to shoot this, Hutch," I said, staring at the heavy, matte black weapon in my trembling hands. As a postmaster, the most dangerous thing I handled was a paper cut from a priority mail envelope. "You don't need to aim. You just point and pull," Hutch grunted, slapping a heavy Kevlar vest over his broad chest. "But remember what we talked about. Slugs won't kill them. It might stagger them, it might tear the meat suit they're wearing, but it won't stop the thing inside. You only shoot if they breach the line to buy us seconds to fall back." "Fall back where?" Martha asked, wiping sweat from her forehead, leaving a streak of white salt dust across her brow. Hutch pointed a thick finger toward the heavy steel door that led to the holding cells in the back. "Cell block. One way in, one way out. 2-inch solid steel bars. If they get into the main lobby, we lock ourselves in cell number 3 and wait for the sun." By 6 p.m., the sky had already surrendered. The Appalachian fog rolled off the ridge, thicker and darker than I had ever seen it. It wasn't the usual pale gray mist. It was a bruised, churning charcoal that swallowed the streetlights one by one as it crept down Main Street. It looked like smoke from a massive, silent subterranean fire. We cut the main lights in the station, plunging ourselves into shadows, illuminated only by the pale, sickly glow of the emergency exit signs and the flickering amber light of a battery-powered camping lantern Hutch placed on his desk. We sat in the gloom, 3 terrified people, armed with guns, metal shavings, and salt, waiting for the gods of the forest to come and collect their due. 7:30 p.m. The silence was absolute. No wind rattled the window panes, no distant hum of an engine. The sensory deprivation was agonizing. My ears strained so hard to hear something, anything, that they began to ring, a high-pitched tinnitus that made my skull ache. 7:59 p.m. I gripped the shotgun so hard my knuckles popped. 8 p.m. The digital clock on Hutch's wall clicked over. Nothing happened. For 5 minutes we just breathed, the sound of our own harsh respiration, the only noise in the station. I looked at Martha. She was silently moving her lips, clutching a silver crucifix tight against her chest. Hutch was a statue, his eyes locked on the reinforced steel of the front door. Then, the police scanner on Hutch's desk crackled to life. It wasn't a burst of static. It was a crisp, clear transmission, despite the fact that the radio tower on the ridge had been down for maintenance since Tuesday. "Breaker, breaker, station 59, this is the welcome wagon, looking for a place to park." It was Mark's voice, or rather the booming, artificial approximation of Mark's voice. The cheerfulness was dialed up to a grotesque, cartoonish level, dripping with malicious intent. Hutch didn't touch the radio, he just stared at it. "Aw, come on, Sheriff," the radio buzzed. It was Chloe's multi-layered synthesized voice now. "Don't give us the silent treatment. We brought a housewarming gift, or should I say, a station-warming gift. We found him trying to hide in his basement. Silly man, doesn't he know the roots go deeper than the foundation?" My stomach dropped into a bottomless abyss. Mayor Higgins. A new sound came through the small speaker. It was a wet, tearing sound, followed by a shrill, bubbling shriek of absolute, mind-shattering agony. It was a human voice, pushed far beyond the limits of sanity. It was Higgins. He was screaming, but the screams were punctuated by the sickening sound of snapping cartilage and tearing meat. Martha squeezed her eyes shut and let out a muffled sob, pressing her hands over her ears. I wanted to vomit. The sheer psychological warfare of it was paralyzing. "He's very talkative now, Hutch," Mark's voice returned, smooth and terrible. "He told us all about your contingency plans. He told us about the cells. We just wanted to let you know we're on the porch." The scanner clicked off. At that exact second, the temperature inside the concrete station plummeted. It didn't happen gradually, it was instantaneous, like walking into a meat freezer. I saw my breath plume out in a white cloud in front of me. Frost began to rapidly crystallize on the inside of the slit windows, creeping across the glass in jagged spiderweb patterns. Then came the smell. The overpowering stench of rotting copper and ancient damp earth seeped through the HVAC vents, so thick it coated the back of my throat with a metallic film. Thud. Something heavy struck the reinforced steel front door. The concrete walls of the station vibrated. Thud, thud, thud. It wasn't the frantic pounding of someone trying to get in. It was slow, rhythmic, mocking. It was the exact same rhythm Chloe had been using to bash her head against the wallpaper in the Miller house. "Hold the line," Hutch whispered, racking the slide of his shotgun. The metallic clack-clack was deafening in the quiet room. I looked down at the iron and salt barrier across the threshold of the front door. The iron filings were beginning to shift. They were vibrating, buzzing like angry hornets. jumping a fraction of an inch off the linoleum floor. The rock salt was turning gray, absorbing the unnatural moisture seeping under the door gap. "Hutch," I stammered, pointing at the floor. "The iron, it's reacting." Suddenly, the rhythmic thudding stopped. A voice drifted under the gap in the door. Not through the radio this time. It was physical, present, and just inches away from us on the other side of the steel. "Let us in, Elias. We're so cold out here." It was my mother's voice. Perfect, unflawed, dripping with maternal sorrow. "Your father is so angry with you, Elias. Why are you locking us out? It hurts so much." "Shut up," I whispered, pressing the butt of the shotgun into my shoulder, tears blurring my vision. "You're dead. You're in the ground." "I'm not in the ground, baby," the thing outside crooned. "I'm in the woods. We're all in the woods, and we're so hungry." "Elias, look at me," Hutch snapped, stepping into my line of sight, blocking the door. "Focus on me. That is a parasite using a memory to open a lock. Do not listen to it." Before I could answer, a tremendous crash shattered the tension. It didn't come from the front door. It came from the roof. The heavy concrete ceiling groaned under a sudden, massive weight. Dust and acoustic tile debris rained down on Hutch's desk. Whatever had just landed up there was colossal. I knew instantly what it was. The petrified antlers, the many eyes, the buck had come to oversee the harvest. The building groaned again, and this time the heavy reinforced glass of the narrow slit windows began to bow inward. "They're pushing the glass," Martha screamed, backing away toward the hallway that led to the holding cells. Through the frost-covered glass, silhouetted against the pitch-black fog, I saw them. Not just Mark and Chloe. There were dozens of them, figures standing perfectly still on the street, illuminated by the faint ambient glow of the station. Neighbors I recognized. People who had moved away or gone missing hiking over the last 20 years. They were all there, wearing their human skins like cheap, ill-fitting suits, their jaws hanging slack, their black eyes staring unblinking at the station. At the front, pressing his face directly against the reinforced glass, was Mayor Higgins. Or at least it used to be him. His body was twisted, his spine bent backward at an impossible angle. His jaw was unhinged, and from inside his mouth, a thick, gray, root-like appendage was slithering out, pressing flat against the glass. The glass hissed, bubbling and melting where the appendage touched it. "They're melting the glass," I yelled, taking a step back. The iron filings on the windowsill were sparking now, actual tiny flashes of light as they furiously tried to repel the corruption. "Fall back," Hutch roared. "To the cells, now!" Martha didn't hesitate. She bolted down the narrow cinder-block hallway toward the heavy steel door of the cell block. I turned to follow her, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. Crack! The reinforced glass of the front window shattered inward, exploding in a shower of icy shrapnel. The iron barrier on the sill flared brightly and then turned to gray ash. A long, impossibly pale arm reached through the broken window, the fingers ending in jagged, blackened points. It gripped the frame, and Mayor Higgins's ruined face pulled itself into the opening. Hutch didn't hesitate. He raised his shotgun and fired. The blast was blinding in the dim room. The slug caught the Higgins thing square in the chest. It didn't bleed red. A geyser of that black, oily sap erupted from the wound, splattering against the walls. The kinetic force threw the creature backward out of the window, but it didn't scream. It just let out a wet, buzzing hiss. "Move, Elias!" Hutch shoved me hard toward the hallway, pumping another shell into the chamber. I scrambled down the corridor, sliding on the slick linoleum. Martha was already inside the cell block, holding the heavy steel door open. The air inside the block smelled intensely of bleach, a stark contrast to the rot filling the lobby. I threw myself through the doorway, my chest heaving. Hutch was right behind me. He backed into the cell block, keeping his shotgun trained on the dark lobby. Through the broken window, the fog was pouring into the station, thick and physical, like a creeping gray flood. And stepping through the fog, walking casually through the destroyed window frame as if they were stepping off an escalator, were Mark and Chloe. They didn't run, they didn't rush, they just glided forward, their unblinking eyes locked on us. "Close it," Hutch shouted. Together, Hutch, Martha, and I grabbed the heavy steel door and slammed it shut. The locking mechanism engaged with a massive echoing clang that rattled my teeth. Hutch spun the deadbolt, locking us inside the windowless concrete box of the cell block. We fell back against the bars of cell number 1, gasping for air in the pitch-black darkness. The only light came from the crack under the steel door, a sickly, flickering gray. We had survived the breach. We were in the most secure room in Hollow Creek. With solid steel between us and them, and a fresh line of iron and salt that Martha had poured across the inside threshold of the block door, we were safe. We just had to wait for the morning. I let my head fall back against the cold iron bars of the cell, closing my eyes. "We made it," I whispered, the adrenaline crash leaving me dizzy. "They can't get through that door." The heavy silence of the cell block settled around us, a stark contrast to the chaos just moments before. Then, a sound cut through the darkness. It didn't come from the other side of the heavy steel door. It came from the shadows of cell number 3, right at the back of the room, behind us. It was a gentle, rhythmic tapping. Thud, thud, thud. Skin hitting concrete. And then Chloe's synthesized, multi-layered voice drifted out of the pitch-black cell. "Oh, Elias," the voices buzzed, dripping with malicious glee. "Did you really think the mayor was the only one who told us your plans? We've been waiting for you." The camping lantern in the lobby outside died, plunging the crack under the door into total blackness. We were locked inside a windowless vault, and we weren't alone. Absolute darkness in a confined space is a physical weight. It presses against your eardrums and tricks your brain into seeing phantom shapes. But the sound echoing from cell number 3 wasn't a phantom. It was wet, real, and entirely inside the room with us. Thud, 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 skin hitting concrete. "Hutch," I hissed, terrified to speak above a whisper. "Light!" Hutch's tactical flashlight clicked on. The blinding beam sliced through the dust, hitting the iron bars of cell number 3, and the thing clinging to the ceiling inside it. It was Chloe, but her limbs were splayed like a crushed spider, bent at impossible backward angles. Her skin was translucent gray, pulsing with thick black sap beneath the surface. Her jaw hung completely slack, her mouth widened to her ears. "How did she get in?" Martha whimpered, collapsing against the heavy steel door at our backs. "It's locked." "The ventilation shaft," Hutch said, his hand steady as he aimed his .357 Magnum. "I thought it was too narrow." Chloe's head tilted, cervical vertebrae snapping loudly. "We are not people, Sheriff." A multi-layered, buzzing voice resonated from the concrete walls around us. "We are the roots, the mycelium. We go where the earth allows." She crawled down the wall and pressed her ruined face against the 2-inch gap between the iron bars. Then she pushed. Flesh ripped. Collarbones snapped cleanly in half to allow her torso to squeeze through the narrow iron gap like toothpaste crushed from a tube. She spilled out onto the floor of the main cell block with a wet, heavy thud. "Light her up!" Hutch roared. The cell block erupted. Hutch fired the Magnum. I pulled the shotgun's trigger. Buckshot and hollow points tore chunks of gray flesh and shredded the remnants of her white dress, but the wounds instantly knitted back together, bubbling with that oily black sap. She lunged. She cleared the 15 feet in a millisecond, slamming into Hutch with the force of a freight train. The flashlight skittered across the floor, coming to rest near a heavy iron floor drain. Chloe pinned the sheriff, her unhinged jaw revealing rows of needle-like teeth snapping inches from his face. "Get off him!" Martha shrieked. The older woman didn't cower. She thrust her silver crucifix forward and threw a handful of coarse rock salt directly into Chloe's black, bottomless eyes. The salt hissed, burning the waxy skin like acid. Chloe shrieked, a sound like grinding metal, and thrashed wildly. But then the flesh along her spine split open. 3 massive thorn-covered roots erupted from her back. One root whipped out, wrapping around Martha's waist. With a sickening crunch of compressing bone, the root constricted. Martha was thrown violently against the bars of cell 2, leaving a smear of bright red blood on the concrete. She didn't move again. I froze. I was a postmaster. I sorted mail. I wasn't equipped to fight the forest. But Hutch was suffocating beneath the creature, his face turning a mottled purple. He looked at me with a silent, desperate command. Survive. I dropped the useless shotgun. My hands flew to my pockets. I grabbed my grandfather's pure iron pocket knife in one hand and the glass jar of iron filings in the other. They hate things that hold shape. I screamed, a guttural primal sound, and tackled the creature. We rolled onto the slick linoleum. The roots slashed my ribs, but I pinned her arm with my knee, raised the glass jar, and smashed it directly into her face. The iron filings embedded deeply into the black sap. The reaction was catastrophic. The chaotic energy of the creature couldn't handle the grounding rigidity of pure iron. The entity shrieked as the sap instantly began to calcify, turning white and brittle. As she thrashed, throwing me off, she lunged for my throat one last time. I thrust my hand upward, burying the iron blade hilt deep into her brainstem. The entity froze. The multi-layered voices gasped in a burst of static. In seconds, the calcification spread like a shockwave, turning the horrific body into a petrified statue of gray ash. It swayed, then shattered into a pile of dust over the floor drain. Silence crashed over the room, broken only by my ragged breathing and Hutch's wet, bubbling coughs. "Hutch!" I choked out, crawling to him. His Kevlar vest was shredded. Deep lacerations crisscrossed his chest, leaking dark blood onto the floor. He was dying. Boom! The entire building shuddered. Dust rained from the ceiling. The things outside, Mark, the mayor, the hollowed-out townsfolk, were tearing down the reinforced front door of the station. The buck was tired of waiting. Hutch grabbed my collar, pressing a ring of keys into my bloody palm. "The floor drain," he gasped, his eyes wild. "It's an old coal chute, drops straight down into the access tunnels beneath the town." "I'm not leaving you," I shouted. Hutch shoved me away with the last of his strength. "You can't carry me. You survive, Elias. Write down the new rules. Make sure the world knows. Go." Crunch. The steel of the lobby door gave way. Survival instinct overrode my loyalty. I swept Chloe's ashes from the iron grate, jammed the silver key into the padlock, and hauled it open. Beneath was a dark shaft, reeking of old coal dust, with a rusted ladder bolted to the stone. I grabbed the flashlight, swung my legs into the hole, and looked back. Hutch had managed to sit up. He retrieved his magnum, aiming it squarely at the cell block door, as the heavy deadbolt began to turn from the outside. I didn't hear them speak. I only heard the deafening roar of Hutch's gun emptying into the dark, followed immediately by a wet, tearing sound that will haunt my nightmares forever. I didn't look up again. I descended. I crawled through the flooded, rotting coal tunnels for hours, navigating the subterranean maze by the fading beam of my flashlight. I expected to see the many-eyed face of the buck at every turn, but the forest was too busy consuming the town above to follow me into the deep earth. When my flashlight beam finally caught the pale light of dawn filtering through a collapsed tunnel exit, I wept. I dragged myself through the dirt and roots, collapsing on a ridge that overlooked the valley. Hollow Creek was gone. It was swallowed entirely by a fog so thick and dark it looked like a motionless gray ocean. There were no buildings, no sounds, No signs of life. Just a hungry void. I am writing this from a cheap motel room 300 miles away. I still have the scars on my ribs, and I still flinch whenever the floorboards creak. I called the state police. They sent troopers up Miller Ridge. They reported finding a quiet, abandoned coal town. No bodies, no blood, no ruined police station. Just empty buildings. They assumed the townsfolk packed up and left overnight due to the failing economy. They don't understand. The town isn't empty. It's fully occupied. The people are still there. They just aren't people anymore. They are the roots. They are waiting. I didn't tell the police about the podcast. Last night, my hands shaking so badly I could barely type. I opened my laptop and searched for urban pioneers in Appalachia. There was a new episode, uploaded yesterday. I clicked play. There was no intro music, just the crisp, high-quality audio captured by those brand new microphones I had delivered to the porch. "Hey guys, Mark and Chloe here." Mark's voice boomed, cheerful and perfectly modulated. "We are absolutely loving the unmatched tranquility of Hollow Creek. It is so quiet up here. We've made so many new friends." Chloe's voice joined in, lacking the multi-layered buzz, sounding terrifyingly, flawlessly human. "You should all come visit. Leave your crowded cities. The housing is so cheap, and we have plenty of room for everyone." A final beat of silence. And then, faintly in the background, underneath the hiss of the mountain wind, I heard it. A sharp, cheerful whistle. The trap is set. They are broadcasting to thousands of headphones across the country. If you hear a whistle in the dark, do not answer. Lock your doors, pour the iron, and whatever you do, never go looking for unmatched tranquility, because when you arrive, the welcome wagon will be waiting.